A faint map drawn by hand in 1351 shows something no sailor of that century should have known. Beyond the familiar coasts, beyond the narrow throat of Gibraltar, a circle appears upon the page, not jagged, not accidental, but perfect, an island of concentric form etched as though geometry itself had risen from the sea. Alongside it, a few faded words whisper of a kingdom drowned, and yet the story of this circle begins earlier still. In 1307, the night before the Templars were seized across France, witnesses claimed ships slipped quietly from La Rochelle, white-mantled figures boarding under cover of darkness. The records are blank. The harbour lists fall silent. Nearly 20 vessels vanish into the fog. Did they scatter to safe havens? Did they dissolve into commerce? Or did some sail westward, chasing a dream told since Plato's time, that of Atlantis, the city swallowed by waves? What follows is not an answer, but a trail of echoes, maps, letters, carvings, fragments of lore that hum with the same refrain. Perhaps more than history, it is the silence between its notes that compels us. This is Serene Myths. If you find comfort in stories that wander through history's mysteries, I invite you to like, subscribe, or simply leave a note in the comments. Tell me the hour and place where you're listening tonight. And now let us begin with the first clue. A fleet that vanished from La Rochelle, leaving only mist in its wake. The year is 1351, and the parchment rests beneath candlelight in a monastery scriptorium. The ink has long faded into the colour of dried blood, yet the shapes it carries have outlasted the centuries. At first glance, the drawing looks like any other medieval map. A coastline crooked like a jagged scar, rivers winding like veins, a compass rose etched with thick, uneven lines. But then your eye falls upon the western edge of the vellum, and there it lies, a circle, symmetrical and strangely complete, sketched far beyond the known world. Not an island that sailors had marked with their journeys, not a promontory stretching from familiar land, but a round, deliberate disk, balanced almost like a coin upon the dark expanse of the sea. The script surrounding it is sparse, as though the hand that drew it hesitated. A faint Latin word curls near the margin, barely legible, a smudge that might once have read submersum, submerged. No captain in Europe could claim to have seen such a thing with their own eyes, and yet here it was, inked with purpose, placed on a map attributed to the Templar tradition. The map did not emerge from a merchant's chest or royal archive. It slipped into record through the quieter channels of Templar scriptoria, whispered into existence like a secret only meant for a select few. In the 14th century, cartography was as much art as science, a blend of speculation, faith, and memory. Coasts were exaggerated, seas distorted, creatures painted into margins as if warning sailors of what lay beneath the waves. Against this backdrop, the circular landmass seems both less and more remarkable. On the one hand, perhaps it was nothing more than an artist's flourish, a symbol meant to represent a spiritual idea or a legendary place. Yet its perfect symmetry, so unlike the haphazard coastlines elsewhere on the map, gives pause. It does not wobble or blur. It stands clean, intentional, almost mathematical. Whispers surrounding this map tell us it bore the touch of the Templar pen. The Knights, dissolved in shame and fire only a few decades earlier, had left behind a trail of documents, some hidden, some destroyed, others reappearing in unexpected corners of Europe. Their reputation was already cloaked in rumour, treasures vanishing from Paris, ships sailing away from La Rochelle, coded writings tucked into church walls. If anyone were to draw a map that hinted at a hidden continent, it would not surprise that the Templars might be involved. They were men who blended steel with scripture, merchants and mystics both, accustomed to reading symbols as if they contained entire worlds. And so, historians of later centuries puzzled over this drawing. Was it an early vision of Atlantis, the drowned island Plato had described nearly 2,000 years before, a kingdom of concentric rings and lost pride? Some thought so. They argued that the Templars, with their connections to Arabic scholars, Jewish cartographers, and Greek texts preserved in the libraries of the East, might have encountered the old dialogues of Plato not as philosophy alone, but as veiled geography. If the island beyond the Pillars truly existed, then surely some fragment of its memory could have reached Europe through those channels. Others, more skeptical, pointed out that medieval mapmakers often included allegories. A circle might symbolize eternity, heaven, or simply the perfection of God's creation. Why read into it an entire vanished civilization when it might have been no more than a theological flourish? To them, the mystery was less about lost continents and more about our own hunger to see patterns where none were intended. And yet, one cannot help but notice how carefully the circle was drawn. The cartographer's hand trembled in the crooked rivers and warped coastlines. But here it steadied, almost reverent. Was he copying from another source, tracing a memory older than himself? Or was he indulging in his own dream, sketching a fantasy he believed should exist? The debate continues, caught between the fragile ink on parchment and the echo of legends whispered across centuries. In truth, we will never know whether the circle was meant as fact, myth, or both. But what lingers is the effect it has on us, the shiver of recognition, as though some part of us already knows what it depicts. Like a bell tolling faintly in mist, the symbol rings across time, suggesting not certainty but invitation. And so the listener, centuries later, imagines standing at that monastery table. The candle flickers, the map rustles softly as a draught curls through the stone chamber. Outside, winter rain taps against the cloister roof. You lean closer to the parchment, tracing the ink with your finger, and in that circle you sense a door opening. Beyond it lies water, distance, and a story waiting to be told. Whether it is Atlantis or something altogether different is less important than the fact that it was placed there, marked deliberately, as if to say, look west. This is where the dream begins. From ink to sea, from speculation to voyage, the circle on the map is not a conclusion, but a beginning, the faintest stroke of a path leading outward. To follow it is to leave the safety of Europe's known shores, to step onto decks where sails strain against Atlantic winds, and to imagine what lies hidden beyond the horizon. The steel of the compass, the rhythm of bells tolling in harbour, the mist curling at the edge of sight, all these become companions as we prepare to move from parchment into the living world of ships and men who once believed the sea could carry them to secrets long drowned. And as the map fades back into shadow, another mystery rises from the waves, the story of a fleet that vanished from La Rochelle, not into storm or surrender, but into silence, as if answering the circle's call. La Rochelle was not an ordinary harbour. It sat on the Atlantic coast of France, a crescent of stone quays and tidal mudflats where the ocean pushed in and pulled away each day like a slow, breathing creature. In the 14th century, it was a city that carried whispers of salt and commerce in its streets, a place where merchants, sailors, and soldiers mingled under the cries of gulls. Yet for the Knights Templar, La Rochelle was more than a port. It was their western gate, their point of contact with the restless Atlantic. From here, their ships could reach England in a matter of days, sail south toward Portugal, or vanish into waters that seemed to stretch without end. The year was 1307, and the Kingdom of France trembled under the will of King Philippe IV, known as Philippe the Fair. Tall, handsome, and unyielding, he carried both the charm of a monarch and the cold edge of a creditor. By autumn, his patience with the Templars had run out. They had grown too wealthy, too independent, too stubborn in their defense of privileges. And so, with the help of Pope Clement V, Philippe issued the infamous order. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, the Templars across France were to be seized, their properties confiscated, their leaders imprisoned. It was a day that would brand the date forever as unlucky in European superstition. The order reached La Rochelle, but by the time soldiers began searching, something peculiar had already occurred. The records of the port showed that close to 20 vessels, galleys and cogs belonging to the Templar fleet had quietly slipped away in the days and nights just before the crackdown. No reports of storms taking them, no lists of capture or destruction, no survivors turning up with tales of wreckage. The ships were there, and then they were not. The ink in the harbour registers simply stopped, the pages turning blank where the entries should have continued. Witnesses spoke of movement in the night, figures cloaked in white mantles walking swiftly across the docks, sailors hurriedly loading crates, sails unfurling against moonlight. One chronicler even claimed that strange ships, unfamiliar in design, had appeared alongside the Templar vessels, and together they sailed westward, vanishing beyond the horizon. These stories, whether rumor or truth, gave rise to the enduring legend. The Templars did not merely hide their wealth, they carried it away, perhaps across the ocean, perhaps toward a land known only to them. A fragment of coded writing attributed, though never conclusively, to Jacques de Montbard adds weight to this idea. It speaks of the last voyage beneath the falling star to the place where ancient kings lie beneath the waters. The phrase falling star seems to indicate the setting sun, the direction of the west, and kings beneath the waters sounds like a poetic echo of Plato's Atlantis, the civilization said to have been swallowed by the sea. Whether the letter is genuine or forged, its imagery has entwined itself into the story, becoming inseparable from the fleet's disappearance. La Rochelle's harbour itself adds a curious detail. Unlike other major French ports of the time, it faced squarely into the Atlantic, its entrance aligned with the ocean winds. While ports like Marseille opened onto the Mediterranean, safe and circumscribed, La Rochelle looked westward with no natural barrier, no protective islands to shield it. It was a place for bold sailors, those who trusted the horizon rather than feared it. This geographical quirk made it an ideal departure point for anyone daring to sail beyond the known. It is no wonder that the image of Templar sails vanishing here has persisted with such strength. But where did they go? Some argue the ships headed north towards Scotland, where the Templars were said to find refuge under sympathetic lords. Others suggest Portugal, whose Order of Christ later inherited much of the Templar legacy and went on to sponsor voyages of discovery in the 15th century. And yet there remains the tantalizing possibility that the fleet struck out westward, not toward another European haven, but into the vastness of the Atlantic, To entertain this possibility is to step into the fog where speculation becomes a kind of legend. Skeptics dismiss the idea. They point out that ships of the early 14th century were not designed for transoceanic journeys. They lacked the capacity to carry provisions for months. Their hulls built more for coastal trade than for Atlantic crossing. Furthermore, no reliable account exists of their arrival anywhere beyond Europe. Without evidence, the story collapses into what it may well be, a myth born of fear, curiosity, and the enduring human urge to explain absence with adventure. And yet the silence in the records gnaws at the imagination. In an age when harbour masters were meticulous, where taxes and tariffs depended on precise accounting, the sudden disappearance of nearly 20 ships is no small matter. That absence, that blank space, has become its own form of evidence. Silence, after all, can speak louder than words, especially when it occurs where detail was expected. La Rochelle thus stands as the first great mystery in the Templar Atlantis story. A city of stone walls and salt air, where one autumn night the bells tolled over an emptying harbour, and by dawn the sails had gone. The soldiers arrived to seize what remained, but the sea had already carried away its secrets. From here, the tale begins to widen. The vanished fleet becomes a thread leading through Gibraltar's straits toward maps marked with curious Latin inscriptions and onward into the strange geometry of Plato's imagined island. The steel of the Templars may have been struck down in France, but their ships, like bells, swallowed by mist, seem to echo still, calling us farther west. In the scattered archives of Europe, certain documents whisper with more force than others. Among them is a curious fragment, attributed, though never proven, to a Templar knight named Jacques de Montbard. Unlike the official records preserved by scribes of the Crown or the Vatican, this writing survives in copies and partial transcripts, its original lost, its authenticity contested. Yet its words cling to the imagination like barnacles to a hull impossible to ignore. The letter speaks of a last voyage undertaken under the light of a falling star. At first, the phrase seems poetic, the kind of imagery a night monk might adopt to cloak his meaning. But to sailors of the Middle Ages, a falling star was often a way of describing the setting sun, the great orb slipping beneath the horizon in the west. To follow the falling star, then, was not metaphor, but navigation. The command to set one's prow toward the Atlantic, away from the familiar, into waters that few Europeans had dared to traverse. And it continues. The destination is described as the place where ancient kings lie beneath the waters. Those words ring with myth. They echo Plato's tale of Atlantis, a civilization punished by the gods, swallowed whole by the sea beyond the Pillars of Hercules. If this document is genuine, it suggests that the Templars, at least some among them, carried not only the will to flee their pursuers in France, but a conviction that a forgotten land awaited them beyond the horizon. Yet the debate over the letter is as old as its rediscovery. Some scholars place it in the early 14th century, just after the infamous arrest of 1307. Others argue it was a Renaissance forgery, a clever invention by antiquarians eager to link the mystique of the Templars with the already popular legend of Atlantis. Without the original parchment, only copies and retellings, certainty slips through our fingers. What survives are fragments written in Latin, phrases repeated in marginal notes, and testimonies from collectors who claim to have seen the letter before it vanished again into obscurity. What gives the document its strange power is not only its content but its timing. If genuine, it would date to around 1310, just 3 years after the disappearance of the La Rochelle fleet. That coincidence alone has fueled centuries of speculation. Did the vanished ship set sail under precisely the instructions this letter described? Was the fleet itself the last voyage, a secret expedition under the cloak of crisis? Or was the letter composed afterward, a way of explaining absence with myth, providing a noble destination for ships otherwise lost to storm or capture? The style of the writing is equally intriguing. It speaks not in the terse, legal phrases of clerical Latin, but in a rhythm almost liturgical, as though crafted for recitation among initiates. Some phrases resemble biblical allusions. The kings beneath the waters mirrors language used in psalms and prophetic books. Others feel closer to the vocabulary of hermetic texts, the cryptic writings that flourished among mystics and alchemists of the late Middle Ages. The blend of sacred and esoteric language makes it difficult to pin down. Was the author a knight, a monk, a mystic, or someone impersonating all three? There is also the question of Jacques de Montbard himself. The name recalls a noble Burgundian family, relatives of Bernard of Clairvaux, the great Cistercian abbot who had been instrumental in shaping the Templar rule centuries earlier. To attach such a name to the letter grants it weight, almost as though the scribe wanted to trace the authority of the Templars back to their holiest origins. Was Montbard truly the author, or was his name invoked as a mask to lend gravitas? What makes the letter more than a curiosity is the way it ties into other scattered clues. Later maps, such as the Salamanca chart, with its faint Latin inscription about a kingdom submerged, echo its imagery. Stories from Rosslyn Chapel, with their carvings of unfamiliar plants, recall the notion of lands far beyond the known. Even Arabic manuscripts from Alexandria, which describe temples of angles and circles drowned by flood, resonate faintly with the idea of ancient kings buried under the waves. The letter becomes a keystone, whether authentic or forged, binding together disparate hints into a narrative path. Yet for every believer there is a skeptic. Historians warn against the temptation of pattern-seeking, the human tendency to draw lines between dots that were never meant to connect. They argue that the phrase about kings beneath the waters could just as easily be allegorical, a sermon on humility, a warning against pride. To set it beside Atlantis is to import meaning not present in the original text. Others suggest that the document may have been altered over time, with scribes inserting phrases that reflected their own interests rather than the intentions of the first author. Still, the image persists, a fleet slipping away from La Rochelle, guided not merely by the winds of survival, but by a vision encoded in words. Imagine, for a moment, those ships on the open sea. The sun dips toward the horizon, the falling star they were told to follow. The knights stand at the prow, steel at their sides, white mantles catching the last light. Behind them lies betrayal and prison. Ahead, the unknown. Whether they sought Scotland, Portugal, or something grander, the imagery of that letter gives their journey a sense of destiny. For the listener drifting into the rhythm of this tale, the letter becomes a kind of chant. The repetition of falling star and ancient kings beneath the waters is like the tolling of a bell in mist, words carried by waves into the night. It may be fiction, it may be forgery. Yet in the quiet, its cadence lingers, urging us westward in thought, into oceans unmarked. And so the coded letter rests not as proof, but as invitation, a fragment that hums with possibility. It is the voice of a ghost, perhaps, or the echo of a dream written down in a hand long gone. Whether true or false, it leads us onward, out of France and into the Straits of Gibraltar, where stone pillars frame the threshold of the wider sea. There, beneath the shadow of Hercules, the voyage continues, and the bells of La Rochelle fade into the sound of waves striking rock. The sea narrows into a throat of stone, where the waters of the Mediterranean surge into the Atlantic. To the ancients, these cliffs were not merely geography. They were myth given shape. The Greeks called them the Pillars of Hercules, the gateway he carved at the edge of the known world. To pass through was to leave the safe basin of the inland sea and to step into the wild and unbounded ocean. By the 14th century, sailors had made the passage countless times, yet the name endured, heavy with both dread and awe. It was here that the Templars, if they indeed sought the Atlantic, would have passed. The corridor of Gibraltar was more than a strait of water. It was a crossroads of cultures. On its northern shore, Castile and Aragon pressed their Christian kingdoms into the rock. To the south, the Marinid dynasty of Morocco held its fortresses. Genoese merchants trafficked in spices and silk through its harbours, while Andalusian sailors knew the currents like the veins of their own hands. The Templars, with holdings scattered across the Iberian Peninsula, were no strangers to this meeting of worlds. Their fortresses at Tomar in Portugal and along the Galician coast created a western lattice of power. To imagine their ships moving silently into the strait is to imagine them threading themselves into a network already prepared for voyages outward. The strait itself was treacherous. Its tides ran swiftly, pouring in and out with the moon, and its winds shifted without warning. Many medieval sailors feared the crossing, calling it a place where the sea could crush a man between its jaws. Yet the Templars, disciplined and well supplied, might have seen it as the very threshold they needed. The gateway westward lay beyond those cliffs. Once the Pillars of Hercules receded behind them, the ocean opened vast and uncharted, and with it the possibility of hidden lands. Chroniclers from the region left small but intriguing hints. A monk in Seville described hearing the toll of bells at night drifting across the strait, though no church was near. Sailors told of a mist that often shrouded the channel, rolling in without warning as if the sea itself sought to veil what passed through. Such accounts may be nothing more than the embroidery of legend, yet they align curiously with the aura of secrecy surrounding the Templars. A fleet slipping through Gibraltar beneath cover of fog, its bells muted, its sails ghostly in moonlight. Such an image fits almost too well with the atmosphere of disappearance that clings to their story. The geography of the corridor offered its own quirks. From the Tower of Tarifa, a watchman could see both Europe and Africa in the same glance. The distance between the continents narrowed to little more than a dozen miles. It was here that the idea of boundaries grew fragile. One could look south and know that another world lay there, full of different languages and faiths, and then turn west to confront an even greater unknown. Perhaps it was this juxtaposition, the proximity of the familiar and the foreign, that made the strait such a potent symbol for those who dreamed of lands beyond. Yet the debate remains. Did the Templars actually sail through? Some argue that their fleet never reached Gibraltar at all, that the ships scattered to safer northern waters or merged quietly into Portuguese commerce. Others believe that even if they passed through, they may have gone no farther than Madeira or the Azores, islands already whispered about by sailors long before Columbus. Without concrete records, the corridor of Gibraltar becomes a place of projection, a stage on which the imagination sets its sails. Still, the symbolism of the passage cannot be ignored. To the Templars, who blended spiritual vision with practical endeavor, the Pillars of Hercules might have represented more than stone cliffs. They were the ancient marker of limits, the edge of the known. To pass them was to defy the boundary itself, to affirm that knowledge lay not only in scripture and stone, but also in the courage to sail where others feared. If the Templars carried with them maps, codes, or half-remembered stories of a sunken kingdom, then this was the gate through which those hopes would have sailed. One can imagine the moment, the fleet, silent beneath the stars, the sound of rigging creaking in the wind. The knights stand upon the decks, their white mantles dim in the moonlight, steel at their belts catching glints of light. The cliffs rise on either side, black and immense like guardians watching them pass. Perhaps one of them thought of Hercules, who had split the mountains to create this very channel, and wondered if they too were about to step into a myth. The bells of the ships ring faintly, their tones swallowed by the mist, leaving only the rhythm of waves against hulls as they slip into the Atlantic. For centuries afterward, the strait remained the hinge of Europe's voyages. Portuguese explorers would later cross here on their way down Africa, and Spanish ships would surge outward toward the Americas. But in the Templar story, Gibraltar carries a special resonance. It is the liminal space, the border where absence begins. The La Rochelle fleet may have been seen here, or it may not. Records are silent, witnesses uncertain. Yet in the silence, the imagination supplies its own testimony. To think of them here is to grant their disappearance a pathway, a logic. If they left France and sought the west, then this was the gate they had to cross, and so the corridor of Gibraltar endures not only as a strait of stone and sea, but as a symbol in the narrative of loss and legend. The Templars, bound in secrecy and silence, vanish into its mists, their sails pointed toward an ocean that few dared to enter. The cliffs echo with the memory of that passage, and the bells toll faintly in imagination, marking the threshold between what is known and what is dreamed. As the fleet drifts beyond the pillars, the story does not pause. It gathers into patterns, marks left on maps, inscriptions scribbled in Latin, faint words about kingdoms submerged. The ocean is vast, but on parchment, lines and dots begin to chart a direction, and the mystery deepens with the ink of Salamanca. When we look at the map of medieval Europe, certain points begin to glow like lanterns in the mist. They are not scattered at random, but seem to align themselves, forming a faint path along the western rim of the continent. Tomar in Portugal, the coasts of Galicia, the harbours of Brittany in northern France. Each of these places bore the mark of the Templars, and together they form a lattice that leans inevitably toward the Atlantic. To trace them is to trace not only geography but intent, as though the order had quietly stitched a western cloak around Europe, fastening its buttons along the edge of the sea. Tomar was more than a fortress. It was the beating heart of the Templars in Portugal. Rising above the river Nabal, the convent of Christ still holds the round church modelled after Jerusalem's Holy Sepulchre. Its architecture carried both martial strength and sacred geometry, an interweaving of stone and symbolism. After the Templars were officially dissolved in 1312, Tomar did not wither. Instead, it was transformed into the headquarters of the Order of Christ, an institution that many believe was a thin veil for continuing Templar traditions under another name. From here, centuries later, Prince Henry the Navigator would launch the Portuguese age of exploration. That lineage, stretching from the Knights to the Caravels, suggests that the Western gaze had been prepared long before Columbus ever set sail. Farther north lay Galicia, with its rugged cliffs and hidden coves. Pilgrims travelled inland to Santiago de Compostela, following the Camino across Spain, but the coastline itself was no less sacred. The Templars maintained holdings here, small castles and way stations that linked trade with devotion. Fishermen told of bells tolling under the waves, as though sunken chapels rang from beneath the surf. Whether these were tricks of tide and rock, or echoes of forgotten shrines, the stories reinforced the aura of mystery that clung to the shoreline. It is easy to imagine a Templar ship anchored in one of these bays, its crew whispering prayers before venturing farther into the Atlantic. Brittany too bore their imprint. The Breton coast, jagged and windswept, faced the Channel, but also opened its arms to the ocean. Here the Templars maintained estates and chapels, modest but strategically placed. The peninsula pointed westward like a finger, and in its villages tales of sailors encountering strange islands persisted through the centuries. The island of High Brazil, for instance, was said to rise from the waves once every 7 years, visible from the Breton shores before slipping back into mist. Whether born of mirage or myth, such stories kept alive the notion that the Atlantic hid more than empty water. When these places, Tomar, Galicia, Brittany, are plotted together on a map, they sketch an arc that seems to invite movement westward, not a straight line, but a curve, like a bow drawn against the sea. The Templars were not merely warriors, they were master organizers, men who thought in patterns of land and power. Could it be that this arc was deliberate, a chain of western watchtowers laid down to support future voyages? Or is the pattern nothing more than our retrospective imagination, drawing meaning where only convenience and circumstance existed? The debate has persisted among historians and enthusiasts alike. Some argue that the Templars, like any order with vast landholdings, placed their estates where they were granted by patrons or where resources were rich, not according to a hidden maritime design. Others insist that the westward tilt is too consistent to dismiss, especially when coupled with legends of vanished fleets and coded letters. What is certain is that these points of presence kept the order tethered to the ocean, giving them access to harbours from which ships could sail into the unknown. A quirky detail adds colour to this picture. In several of these western harbours, stonemasons left small carvings of the Templar cross, not on churches, but on quay markers and mooring stones. At Tomar's river docks, faint red crosses were once said to be visible on the stone bollards where ropes were tied. In Galicia, a coastal chapel dedicated to St. James bore a cross not on its altar, but etched into the seawall. Such markings suggest that the Templars thought not only of defending land, but of sanctifying departure, blessing the very act of setting sail. It is as though the edge of the sea was itself a threshold that required consecration. This sense of consecrated departure lingers in the way local traditions preserved their memory. In Brittany, fishermen who passed the ruins of a Templar chapel would dip their oars in silence, a gesture of respect as if acknowledging unseen guardians. In Portugal, legends grew that the Order of Christ held secret charts, maps of islands lying far in the Atlantic, knowledge inherited from their Templar predecessors. While hard evidence remains elusive, the persistence of these tales speaks to the impression left by the Order's maritime posture. And so, when one steps back and gazes at the map of Western Europe, the arc shines faintly in the mind's eye. Tomar, Galicia, Brittany, dots of light in the mist forming a constellation across the shoreline. Were they merely practical estates, or were they part of a larger design pointing toward the open sea? We may never know. But the pattern hums with possibility, like the ringing of a bell whose sound is felt as much as heard. As the first chapter of our story draws to its close, the image is set. A map with a mysterious circle, a fleet that vanished from La Rochelle, a letter whispering of a voyage toward the setting star, and now a chain of western strongholds sketching a path into the ocean. Together, these pieces form a rhythm, a pulse beating westward, as though the very steel of the Templars longed to test the mists beyond the horizon. If this rhythm has carried you along so far, perhaps you might let it echo further. A gentle tap of appreciation, alike a small gesture, lets me know the bells of this tale have reached your ears. And with that, the harbour grows quiet, the tide pulls outward, and the parchment of Salamanca waits, faint words ready to guide the next steps into mystery. In the hushed halls of Salamanca, the echo of footsteps lingers beneath vaulted ceilings, stone and shadow blending into a timeless silence. This Spanish city, famed for its university and its libraries, was already in the Middle Ages a gathering place for scholarship and faith. Among the manuscripts and charts stored here, one fragile map has long fascinated historians. It is not a world map in the grand sense, but rather a coastal chart, simple in its design, yet it carries a peculiarity that has turned it into a relic of mystery. Drawn in the 14th century, the map presents the Strait of Gibraltar with unusual clarity. The familiar two promontories, Europe to the north, Africa to the south, rise like guardians at the mouth of the sea. But what captures attention is not the careful depiction of the pillars themselves, but what lies just beyond them. A series of dots stretches outward into the Atlantic, fading like a trail of breadcrumbs across empty space. And beside those dots, written faintly in Latin script, are the words "Ubi est via ad regnum submersum." Where is the way to the sunken kingdom? The phrase is haunting. It does not declare that such a kingdom exists, it poses a question. Yet in posing it, the map maker has placed the idea into ink, anchoring speculation to geography. No longer is the notion of a submerged realm confined to myth or philosophy. Here it is suggested on a chart that might have guided actual sailors. What made the scribe commit such words to parchment? Was it rumour, allegory, or an echo of knowledge passed through hidden channels? The curious detail of the dots stretching into the ocean adds further intrigue. They do not correspond to known islands of the time, nor do they align neatly with later discoveries like the Azores or Madeira. They are scattered, uneven, suggestive of something half-remembered, a memory rather than a measurement. Some scholars argue that they may have been symbolic, representing not land at all, but stages of a spiritual journey. Others see in them the faint outline of oral traditions, sailors' tales of islands glimpsed in mist and forgotten in storm. The map's association with Salamanca adds another layer to the story. This was a center where Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions intersected, a place where scholars translated Arabic works into Latin, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Through these channels, ideas of Atlantis could have traveled, refracted through different lenses. Plato's original dialogues, Arabic cosmographies, medieval legends of lost islands. To imagine a Templar scribe here copying or adapting such sources is not far-fetched. The order's ties to Iberia were strong, and Salamanca's libraries would have been accessible to their network of allies and patrons. Yet skepticism persists. Some historians caution that the phrase may not have been original to the 14th century map at all, but added later by an enthusiastic hand, eager to infuse the chart with mystery. Faint handwriting is notoriously difficult to date with precision. What one scholar sees as authentic medieval script, another dismisses as a later flourish, a kind of antiquarian graffiti. If the inscription was indeed a later addition, then the trail of dots loses its connection to Atlantis and reverts to the commonplace, simply vague marks of the sea. But even this doubt does not fully silence the effect of the map. For the listener, the power lies less in verifying its authenticity than in surrendering to its imagery. Imagine the parchment spread across a wooden table in a monastery cell. A candle burns low, casting shadows over the ink. A finger traces the coastline, lingers at the strait, then follows the faint dots outward. The Latin words catch the eye. Where is the way to the sunken kingdom? The question hovers in the air like incense, unanswered, yet resonant. To sailors of the age, such a phrase would not have seemed absurd. The sea was filled with mysteries, and many believed that lands lay hidden just beyond the horizon. Fishermen told tales of islands appearing and vanishing with the fog. Legends of St. Brendan's voyage describe paradises glimpsed in the Atlantic. Norse sagas spoke of Vinland, a place across the ocean where grapes grew wild. To place a sunken kingdom among these possibilities was not to create fantasy, but to extend the horizon of the plausible. A quirk of the Salamanca map is the way the Templar cross is positioned. Unlike most maps of the time where crosses mark churches or holy sites, here one appears curiously near the Pillars of Hercules, almost as though blessing the passage. Was it simply the mapmaker's flourish, or was it meant to sanctify the act of sailing west? That cross, paired with the haunting Latin phrase, gives the impression that the voyage itself carried spiritual weight. The way to the sunken kingdom was not just a line of navigation, it was a pilgrimage, a quest, cloaked in devotion. Debate swirls around whether the map indicates genuine Templar knowledge of Atlantic routes. Some scholars argue that it reflects contact with seafarers from Portugal or Galicia, men who already ventured far from shore in search of fish and trade. Others believe it may have been inspired by stories brought back by Arab geographers who described islands in the Sea of Darkness. Still others dismiss it outright as symbolic, a metaphor for seeking heaven beyond earthly limits. The truth may never be known, but the question carved into its margin remains a riddle that refuses to fade. And so the Salamanca chart joins the chorus of whispers. A fleet vanishing from La Rochelle, a letter urging pursuit of the setting star, a strait where bells toll in mist, and now a map that dares to ask where the path to a sunken kingdom might lie. Each piece does not confirm the others, yet together they weave a pattern, as though independent voices have been tuned to the same melody. As the map is rolled once more and placed upon the shelf, the imagination does not rest. The words echo, "Where is the way?" They push us onward toward philosophers and their tales of islands beyond the pillars, towards stories of arrogance punished and civilizations drowned. The ink of Salamanca points us straight into the memory of Plato, whose voice still murmurs across the centuries, guiding us deeper into the sea of myth. Long before parchment in Salamanca bore the faint question of a sunken kingdom, a voice from antiquity had already planted that vision in the imagination of the West. It was Plato, the philosopher of Athens, who in his dialogues Timaeus and Critias spoke of an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, an island vast and wealthy, proud and doomed. Written in the 4th century BCE, his tale has echoed through centuries like a bell carried by wind, resonating each time the world has sought to explain its mysteries. The island, Plato wrote, was a marvel of order and geometry. Its capital was not a sprawl of streets or haphazard clusters of houses, but a pattern of concentric rings, alternating circles of land and water, each perfectly proportioned, connected by bridges and canals. At the center stood a temple gleaming with orichalcum, a metal said to shine like fire. The kings of this realm ruled with wisdom and power, their fleets crossing seas, their armies expanding influence. Yet pride corroded their virtue, and in punishment the gods struck them down. In a single day and night of misfortune, earthquakes and floods swallowed the island whole, leaving only a memory beneath the waves. To the Athenians who first heard the dialogue, the story may have sounded like myth wrapped in philosophy, a parable of hubris rather than a literal geography. But for later generations, the vividness of Plato's description invited speculation. Was he recording a memory passed down from Egyptian priests, as he claimed? Was he dressing moral lessons in the garments of lost history? Or was Atlantis an invention, a tale crafted to illustrate the dangers of human arrogance? What lingers most strongly in the imagination are the concentric circles. Unlike vague references to distant lands, this image carries the precision of a diagram. Rings of land and sea, alternating, measured, orderly. Such a structure feels both possible and uncanny. No natural island takes such form, yet the vision tempts us to believe it once did. Perhaps it was engineered, a city designed by hands that mastered geometry beyond what we can imagine for its age. Or perhaps it is no more than the philosopher's dream, a city of ideas given form in metaphor. Through the centuries, the motif of circles has surfaced again and again, as though echoing Plato's tale. Monastic diagrams of paradise depict concentric enclosures, heaven within heaven. Alchemists drew circles within circles to illustrate cosmic processes. In Rosslyn Chapel, carved spirals wind upward, evoking the same rhythm. Even in Salamanca's chart, the dots stretching into the ocean suggest a path of rings, faint reminders of Plato's design. These echoes may be coincidence, or they may reveal how deeply the philosopher's story seeped into the European mind. A quirky detail in the dialogue itself has puzzled readers. Plato claimed that the Atlanteans possessed orichalcum, a substance second only to gold in value, and that their temples were adorned with it in shining brilliance. Some believe orichalcum was a poetic name for bronze, others that it referred to a rare alloy, perhaps one lost to time. The idea of a glowing reddish metal has enchanted storytellers, lending Atlantis an aura not only of wealth but of otherworldly craft. It is as though the island's destruction was not merely the loss of land, but the disappearance of a knowledge of materials, a technology swallowed along with the city. Debate over Plato's intentions remains unresolved. Scholars have pointed out that in Timaeus he shifts suddenly from cosmology to myth, weaving the story of Atlantis almost abruptly, as if inserting a parable into a philosophical discourse. In Critias, the narrative breaks off mid-sentence, unfinished, leaving us suspended in uncertainty. Did he plan to continue, or did he deliberately leave it incomplete, a fragment meant to haunt the reader with silence? That silence has become as influential as the words themselves, inviting others to fill the gap with speculation. Some argue that Plato was relaying a genuine tradition preserved by Egyptian priests who told Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, of a great war between ancient Athens and Atlantis. If true, then the story would be a cultural memory, reaching across centuries, anchored in real catastrophe. Others dismiss this, pointing out that no Egyptian texts corroborate it, and that the details seem crafted to flatter Athens, portraying it as the heroic city that resisted a mighty empire. For them, Atlantis is literary invention, not history. Yet the story's survival suggests it touched something deeper than allegory. For medieval listeners who lived in a world where seas concealed both danger and promise, the tale of a drowned kingdom resonated with both fear and longing. If an island had existed and then perished, might not others wait still, hidden in the ocean's folds? To read Plato in a candlelit monastery was not to pass philosophy only, but to dream of geography that might yet be revealed. Imagine then a Templar scribe hunched over a desk in Iberia, translating Aristotle and Plato from Arabic versions, his steel gauntlet set aside for ink and parchment. The description of rings catches his attention. He sketches a small diagram in the margin, circles alternating, a dot at the center. His thoughts drift from Athens to the Atlantic, from myth to map. Perhaps he wonders whether the rings could correspond to an island beyond Gibraltar, where rumors of distant lands already swirled. Perhaps the phrase regnum submersum echoes in his mind as he draws, binding Plato's tale to the questions of his own age. The concentric island, real or imagined, thus becomes a bridge between antiquity and the Middle Ages, between philosophy and exploration. Its geometry haunts the imagination, its destruction warns of pride, and its absence fuels the hope that something might yet be found. Whether Atlantis was ever more than a story is secondary to the fact that it continues to lure us westward, urging us to search where maps blur into ocean. And so, as the dialogue fades into silence, as Plato's unfinished words hang in the air, the story does not end but transforms. The circles ripple outward, carried into later centuries, inspiring mapmakers to draw symbols that may or may not point to truth. The Salamanca chart, the coded letter of the setting star, the vanished fleet, all begin to feel less like isolated mysteries and more like echoes of a single ancient song. The melody carries us onward, across centuries, to a later age when Jesuit scholars in Avignon would draw diagrams that concealed hidden shapes, symbols that, when mirrored, revealed concentric rings once more. The dialogue of Plato is not done. It resurfaces in ink and parchment, waiting to be discovered anew. By the 18th century, the name of the Templars had become both legend and shadow. Their suppression lay more than 400 years in the past, yet whispers of their secret knowledge still crept through the margins of European thought. It was in this later age, in the papal city of Avignon, that another curious artifact emerged, a Jesuit manuscript dated 1742, presented not as a chart of seas or lands, but as a spiritual diagram. At first sight, the drawing seemed entirely in keeping with the devotional art of the time. Concentric circles radiated outward, each labeled with virtues, vices, and stages of the soul's ascent toward God. Such diagrams were common among mystics and teachers, serving as visual aids to meditation. The manuscript would not have stood out among the shelves of Jesuit libraries, filled as they were with allegories and emblems. But a peculiar feature distinguished this particular sheet. When the page was placed against a mirror, the design revealed something unexpected. The circles, once filled with text, transformed into the outline of an island. Within the mirrored symmetry, one could discern rings of land and water, concentric and deliberate, so strikingly similar to Plato's Atlantis that the resemblance felt more than accidental. What made the matter more intriguing was a fragmentary word inscribed at the margin. The letters alta appeared, cut off as though interrupted mid-writing. Some claimed it was the beginning of Atlantis, a name never written openly in the diagram, but hidden, waiting to be unveiled through the trick of reflection. Was this coincidence, a quirk of mirrored script, or had the scribe intentionally embedded a secret, concealing in plain sight what could not be declared outright? The Jesuits of Avignon were known for their erudition, their willingness to engage both classical texts and contemporary science. They preserved manuscripts that drew upon Platonic and Aristotelian traditions, translating and commenting with the rigor of scholars and the devotion of priests. To find a diagram among their papers that echoed Plato's description of a sunken island was not impossible. Yet the deliberate mirroring, the concealed letters, and the concentric design invited suspicion of something more than mere coincidence. One quirky detail adds to the enigma. The diagram was bound in a collection titled Schemata Spiritus, or Figures of the Spirit. Within this volume were drawings of ladders reaching heavenward, hearts pierced with arrows, circles representing the celestial spheres. But tucked amid these predictable emblems, the mirrored island stood apart, its geometry more exact, its execution more careful. It was as if the scribe had paused from devotional work to indulge another tradition, slipping a forbidden memory into the pages of piety. Debate has surrounded this artifact ever since its rediscovery. Some scholars argue it is an innocent example of pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns where none were intended. The concentric circles of spiritual diagrams resemble Atlantis only because we wish to see them that way. The half-written word alta might have been nothing more than a scribe beginning altere, Latin for altar, a perfectly ordinary term for a religious context. To build a theory of hidden geography upon such fragments, they warn, is to construct castles from smoke. Others, however, note the curious precision of the design. Unlike most spiritual diagrams, which often varied in shape and proportion, this one kept its circles remarkably consistent, measured with care. The channels between rings resembled waterways more than symbolic separations. Even if it was not meant as a literal map, its resemblance to Plato's description is striking enough to raise questions. Was the scribe playing with double meanings, producing a diagram that could serve both as allegory for meditation and as secret homage to the lost island? The timing also fuels speculation. By 1742, Europe was well into its age of exploration. New maps crowded the presses, filled with coastlines of the Americas, the Pacific, and the far north. Yet amid this flood of geographical certainty, the old myth of Atlantis had not died. Philosophers and naturalists debated its possible location. Some placed it in the Atlantic, others in the Mediterranean, some even beneath the ice of Antarctica. To slip a veiled reference to Atlantis into a Jesuit manuscript at this moment might have been less about preserving ancient Templar secrets and more about participating in the wider cultural fascination of the age. And yet there is the problem of the mirror. Why design a diagram whose hidden form only emerges when reflected? Mirrors carried symbolic weight in both mysticism and alchemy. They represented truth revealed through inversion, the unveiling of hidden realities. To embed a secret map in a mirrored diagram was to suggest that truth itself could not be seen directly, but only when the world was turned backward. Such symbolism resonates deeply with the aura of the Templars, whose reputation thrived on secrecy, inversion, and hidden knowledge. Imagine for a moment a Jesuit scholar seated in a study in Avignon, candlelight flickering on polished glass. He places the diagram against the mirror, watches the rings align into an island, and smiles faintly at the illusion. Perhaps he thinks of Plato's dialogues, perhaps of the murmurs about Templar treasures and vanished fleets. He does not write Atlantis outright, but leaves a half-word, a suggestion, a whisper. He closes the book, places it on a shelf, and in doing so plants another seed in the long garden of myth. For us, centuries later, the manuscript remains both tantalizing and uncertain. It is too late to question the scribe, too late to know his intentions. We can only study the circles, the faint letters, and the mirrored shape, and wonder, did the Templars leave a legacy of hidden maps, passed quietly through monastic libraries until they reached Jesuit hands? Or did a pious scholar simply amuse himself with an allegory that accidentally echoed Plato? The truth dissolves in the mirror's reflection, neither fully here nor there. What endures is the rhythm of repetition, circles upon circles, patterns reappearing across time. From Plato's Athens to Salamanca's question, and now to Avignon's mirror, the motif of rings persists, humming like a low bell beneath the surface of history. Each echo strengthens the sense that the legend of Atlantis, whether real or imagined, has woven itself inseparably into the intellectual fabric of Europe. And so the mirrored diagram becomes another breadcrumb on the path. The circles ripple outward once more, carrying us from Avignon toward Portugal, where in the records of Tomar, strange notes appear about voyages and unfamiliar stars. If the Jesuit scribe left us only a reflection, the Portuguese documents promise something more direct. Dates of departure, observations of constellations, traces of journeys that hint at the possibility of return. The rings fade and the night sky brightens, ready to guide us to the next clue. On the banks of the Nabao River in Portugal stands the Convent of Christ, its walls weathered by centuries, its towers rising above olive groves and tiled roofs. Once the stronghold of the Knights Templar in Iberia, Tomar became the seat of the Order of Christ after the suppression of the Templars in the early 14th century. Though the name changed, the continuity of tradition is undeniable. Many have believed that what the Templars could no longer pursue openly, they preserved in this new guise, their ambitions clothed in a fresh mantle, yet driven by the same flame. Among the archives associated with Tomar, there exists a series of entries that have long puzzled historians. They are not grand declarations or sweeping charts, but small, almost casual notes in records of navigation. The entries speak of departures calculated from the Gate of Hercules, the ancient name for the Strait of Gibraltar, to mark a journey not from Lisbon or Porto, but from the mythic threshold itself, is unusual. It suggests that the scribes who kept these logs thought of the strait not simply as a place on the map, but as a symbolic point of departure, a hinge between the known and the unknown. And the records also mention stars unfamiliar to European sailors of the period. Constellations described with odd names appear in the margins, their patterns not matching the familiar northern skies. One note speaks of a southern cross of fire, a grouping of stars that might recall the constellation later known as the Southern Cross, visible only when one has sailed far below the horizon of Europe. For a medieval Portuguese scribe to record such a detail raises difficult questions. Had they heard the description second-hand from Arab navigators? Or had ships under their watch truly sailed far enough to see such stars with their own eyes? What makes these fragments more tantalizing is their context. Portugal in the 14th century was not yet the maritime empire it would become. Its sailors fished and traded along the coast, but the great age of exploration had not begun. To read of strange stars in such an early record feels like an echo arriving before its time, a whisper of voyages centuries ahead. It is as though the Templar legacy at Tomar foreshadowed the discoveries that would later launch from these very shores under the flag of the Order of Christ. A quirky detail appears in the margins of one such manuscript, a small drawing of a ship, crudely sketched with sails marked not by the cross of Portugal, but by a simpler, earlier Templar cross. The ink has faded, the lines are childlike, but the symbol remains recognizable. Was it doodled by a bored scribe, or was it a deliberate marker of continuity, a reminder that these records carried forward the memory of the Templar fleet? The little drawing stands like a ghost ship on the page, haunting the words with silent testimony. The debate surrounding these documents has been fierce. Some historians dismiss them as later interpolations, arguing that scribes in the 15th or even 16th century might have inserted details to lend antiquity to Portugal's maritime tradition. Others defend their authenticity, pointing out that the handwriting and ink are consistent with 14th century practices. If genuine, the references to unknown stars remain deeply puzzling, for they imply that someone connected to Tomar had knowledge that should have been impossible for their time. Even if we allow that the descriptions came second-hand, passed from Arab or African sailors who ventured farther south, the fact that the Templar heirs at Tomar preserved these notes is telling. It suggests an active interest, a curiosity about lands beyond, a willingness to collect fragments of information that did not yet have practical use. To ask about this Southern Cross of Fire in the 14th century is to admit that horizons stretched beyond familiar seas, and that the westward gaze of the Templars had not dimmed with their suppression. Imagine a night at Tomar, the convent quiet, its cloisters filled with the scent of candle wax and incense. A scribe bends over a wooden desk, recording the day's observations. He writes of winds, tides, and departures from the Gate of Hercules. Then, almost as an afterthought, he adds a note about stars, strange, unfamiliar, placed like jewels across the dark. He may not understand their significance, yet he writes them down, leaving us centuries later to wonder whether he had glimpsed a map of the sky carried from distant lands, or whether his brothers had truly seen them themselves. The stars, after all, were the oldest guides of sailors. Long before compasses were common, navigators steered by constellations, reading the heavens as one reads a script. For a Templar or a Knight of the Order of Christ, the stars held both practical and spiritual meaning. They were the handiwork of God, but also the markers of direction, the lights that could lead one outward into mystery. To note unfamiliar constellations was not only to record observation, but to step into a story larger than the known world. Skeptics remind us that human imagination often outruns evidence. A few vague notes about stars do not prove that Templars crossed the Atlantic or reached southern seas. They may simply reflect curiosity, the collection of hearsay, or even errors in transcription. Yet to those inclined to wonder, the very presence of such notes in Tomar's records feels like the continuation of a thread, a thread that began with vanished fleets, coded letters, and maps inscribed with haunting questions. What is certain is that Tomar became the cradle of Portugal's later explorations. From its convent, Prince Henry would direct voyages that pushed farther down Africa's coast, preparing the way for transatlantic journeys. The ships that left those docks carried crosses on their sails, the successors of Templar insignia. Whether by accident or design, the legacy of the Templars lived on in these voyages, the dream of horizons beyond the horizon preserved in wood, canvas, and prayer. And so the records of Tomar, with their strange stars and curious notes, remain an ambiguous gift. They are not proof of voyages across the Atlantic, yet they are not silence either. They are fragments, glimmers, sparks in the dark, suggesting that someone, somewhere, had looked beyond and felt compelled to mark it down. As the ink dries, the manuscript closes and the convent settles into night. But the question lingers, like a bell tolling beneath the cloister arches. Were these merely scraps of rumour, or were they echoes of journeys forgotten by history? The answer eludes us, slipping into the shadows. Yet the fragments join the chorus, another piece in the pattern that is slowly taking shape. And in the next moment, the pattern itself begins to gather. From La Rochelle's vanished fleet to Salamanca's haunting words, from Plato's circles to Avignon's mirrored diagram, and now to Tomar's strange stars. These breadcrumbs form a trail. Soon they will be gathered together, counted like beads on a rosary, a checklist of signs pointing west. When stories scatter across centuries, they risk dissolving into mist. A fleet vanishes here, a map appears there, a letter whispers in one decade, and a diagram flickers in another. Without order, the pieces drift apart like ships losing sight of one another in fog. Yet every so often, history seems to invite us to pause, to gather what fragments we have, and to hold them together in a single hand. It is in this spirit that we arrive now, looking back at the trail behind us, counting each step, and watching how they fall upon the line of time. The first clue is La Rochelle, the harbour of stone walls and tidal waters. The year was 1307, and the morning of October 13th brought soldiers with royal warrants. Yet when they searched the quays, the records revealed silence. Nearly 20 ships had vanished without wreckage, without seizure, without farewell. A disappearance is not evidence of presence elsewhere, yet it is evidence of absence here, and in that absence lies mystery. The second clue emerges in 1310 in the form of the coded letter attributed to Jacques de Montbard or to someone cloaked in his name. It spoke of a last voyage, guided by the falling star, toward the place where ancient kings lie beneath the waters. Its words may be poetry, forgery, or truth, yet their rhythm calls us westward. The image of kings drowned beneath the sea echoes Plato, and the timing so soon after La Rochelle feels less like coincidence and more like continuation. The third clue belongs to 1351, when the mysterious map placed a perfect circle upon the edge of the Atlantic. Unlike crooked coasts or wavering rivers, this circle was drawn steady and deliberate, symmetrical as a coin. A faint word, perhaps submersum, clings to its margin. It is not proof of Atlantis, but it is an invitation to imagine it, and an invitation written at a time when memory of the fleet's disappearance was still fresh. The fourth clue leaps centuries forward to 1742, when a Jesuit manuscript in Avignon disguised a map as a spiritual diagram. Concentric rings, when mirrored, revealed themselves as an island uncannily close to Plato's description. A half-word, altar, lingers like a fragment of confession. The ink may have been allegory, the mirror may have been symbolism, yet the resemblance is undeniable, as though the ghost of Atlantis had wandered from philosophy into theology, leaving its shadow on a page meant for prayer. And the fifth clue rests in Tomar, in the convent, where Templars became the Order of Christ. There, records speak of departures calculated from the Gate of Hercules, as if voyages were not simply measured from ports, but from thresholds of myth. In those margins appear notes of stars not familiar to Europe, a southern cross of fire, constellations that should have been unseen. Whether borrowed from Arab sailors or observed firsthand, they leave us with the unsettling impression that someone connected to Tomar knew more of the world than their time should have allowed. La Rochelle, the letter, the circle, the mirror, the stars. 5 clues scattered across centuries, bound by a rhythm that seems to hum with insistence. Taken alone, each is fragile, subject to doubt, easily dismissed. Together they form a chain that, though still tenuous, feels more than accidental. It is as though the story of a sunken kingdom exerts a gravitational pull, drawing documents and legends into its orbit, binding them into a pattern that persists despite attempts to dismiss it. The timeline stretches across centuries, and it is worth laying it clearly as one might place stones across a river to see the path emerge. First, the year 1307, the sudden vanishing of the Templar fleet. Next, 1310, the coded letter, a whisper of westward destiny. Then the 1351, the map with its enigmatic circle. Time passes, centuries roll forward, and in 1742 the Avignon manuscript offers its mirrored rings. Alongside these points, Tomar's records anchor the narrative, straddling centuries, hinting that the knowledge was not entirely forgotten, but carried quietly in convent walls. Skeptics argue that this sequence is illusory, that we are arranging fragments into order simply because human minds crave patterns. The fleet may have scattered to Scotland or Portugal without romance. The letter may be forgery. The map may be allegory. The diagram may be coincidence. The notes about stars may be hearsay. Each point admits a mundane explanation, and yet the pattern remains like a melody hummed by 5 different singers who never met but whose voices nonetheless harmonize. There is another way to see this chain, not as proof of voyages to Atlantis, but as proof of something subtler, the persistence of a dream. Across centuries, across languages, across institutions, the idea of a kingdom submerged has refused to die. It has reappeared in ink, in stone, in story, always whispering of lands beyond the horizon. Even if Atlantis never existed, the fact that so many different hands kept writing about it suggests that it held power in the imagination, a power strong enough to shape choices, inspire voyages, and sanctify departures. A quirky observation threads through these 5 clues. Each one carries the theme of silence. La Rochelle is silent in its missing ships. The letter is silent in its uncertainty of authorship. The map's circles speak silently without explanation. The Jesuit diagram hides its island in mirrored silence. Tomar's notes slip stars into margins without commentary. It is as though the true hallmark of the Atlantis story is not loud proclamation, but quiet absence, a knowledge too fragile or too forbidden to be spoken outright. Imagine the clues laid before you as stones upon a table, each one small, unremarkable by itself, but arrange them and a path appears, leading westward into the sea. It may be coincidence, it may be imagination, yet the path calls as though some echo of drowned kings still beats beneath the Atlantic waves, urging us to follow. And now, as we step beyond this second chapter, the the story turns inward. The Vatican holds archives of immense depth, shelves groaning with centuries of records. But there too we find silence, pages missing, files sealed, letters that speak only in hints. If the Templars carried dreams of Atlantis westward, the papal halls may have known and may have chosen to bury that knowledge in silence. Before we walk into those halls, allow me to pause with you here. If this trail of clues, this gentle gathering of fragments, has kept you company in the quiet hours, a small gesture of appreciation, a subscription, a tap of support, is like placing another candle along the path. Together we can keep walking softly into the next chamber, where silence itself becomes the loudest voice. The Vatican Library is a labyrinth of silence. Its corridors stretch beneath frescoed ceilings, its shelves groan beneath centuries of parchment and vellum, each page a sliver of the past preserved in ink. Here, among illuminated psalters and canon law, among chronicles and translations, the story of the Templars should be as clear as day. The order was condemned under papal authority. Its trials were recorded with precision. Its property was inventoried in meticulous lists. And yet, when one turns to the files, expecting the certainty of bureaucratic completeness, something peculiar arises. Gaps, pages missing, folders marked but empty, threads cut short, as though the narrative of one of Christendom's most powerful brotherhoods had been quietly redacted by an unseen hand. This is most evident in the materials surrounding the years just after 1307. One would expect an abundance of correspondence between Pope Clement V and his bishops, for the arrest of the Templars was one of the most dramatic acts of his papacy. Some letters survive, but others, by all accounts, have vanished. References in inventories hint at their existence, entries that mention epistolae de militibus templi, letters concerning the soldiers of the temple, but when the drawers are opened, only silence greets the researcher. In the Vatican, absence becomes a presence in itself. Among the fragments that do survive, one stands out, a letter dated around 1310 addressed to Clement, speaking in cautious phrases of the light buried beneath the waters to the west. The author remains uncertain. The signature is smudged, perhaps deliberately. The phrasing is enigmatic, but those who have studied it note how it echoes the coded letter attributed to Jacques de Montbard. Light buried beneath the waters seems a poetic way of describing a hidden truth, a wisdom or treasure lost across the sea. Was this a metaphor for heresy, or was it a veiled allusion to something more literal, a belief in knowledge submerged, waiting to be retrieved? Clement's response, preserved in a different register, is even more curious. It is brief, evasive, and closes with a line often quoted in hushed tones, "Silentium faciat quod justitia non potest." Let silence do what justice cannot. It is an extraordinary phrase, one that admits the inadequacy of law, yet embraces the power of silence as a tool. What did Clement mean? Some read it as an instruction to suppress scandal, to let time erase what judgment could not. Others interpret it as resignation. The mysteries surrounding the Templars were too deep, and silence was the only response left to the pontiff. The Vatican archives hold more than missing letters. There are also sealed files, collections of documents marked with sigils or codes. One bundle bears the inscription Reguant 8, a cipher whose meaning has eluded generations of scholars. Was it an abbreviation, a filing code, or an intentional obfuscation? Requests to open the bundle have been denied or deferred, sometimes on the grounds of fragility, sometimes simply without explanation. It is as though the very bureaucracy that catalogued so faithfully has, in this case, chosen opacity over clarity. A quirky rumour circulating among archivists claims that within one of these sealed bundles lies a chart that resembles no earthly land drawn in red ink, annotated with fragments of Greek and Arabic phrases. No one has confirmed this rumour, yet its persistence adds to the sense that something lies hidden, not destroyed but withheld. If the Vatican did preserve records of Templar voyages or beliefs about lost kingdoms, then the silence is not absence but secrecy, a decision to let shadows speak louder than parchment. Debate, of course, divides historians. Skeptics argue that the missing pages are no mystery at all, merely the inevitable losses of time. Fires, floods, wars, and human negligence have stripped archives of countless treasures. Why should the Templars be different? To them, the gaps are nothing more than accidents, and to interpret them as deliberate silence is to indulge in conspiracy. Yet others reply that the gaps fall too neatly. The years surrounding 1307, the period when the fleet vanished and rumours of westward voyages first stir, are precisely those where the silences deepen. Absence, when it occurs exactly where we most expect presence, feels less like chance and more like choice. Consider the Vatican itself, an institution that has endured storms for centuries by mastering the art of discretion. If knowledge dangerous to the faith or to political stability had indeed been entrusted to the Church, would it not be natural for it to bury such knowledge in silence rather than risk exposure?
Do you see that?
The phrase, "let silence do what justice cannot," may thus be more than a comment on heresy. It may be a guiding principle for preservation and concealment. Imagine, for a moment, a clerk in the Vatican in the 14th century ordered to sort the papers of the temple. He reads the letter about light beneath the waters. He hesitates. To copy it is to preserve its dangerous suggestion. To destroy it is to risk accusations of tampering. Instead, he places it in a sealed bundle, marks it with a code, and locks it away. His action is not destruction but burial, turning words into relics hidden beneath stone and silence. The Vatican's aura adds weight to this imagery. Its halls echo with footsteps but never with answers. The frescoes gaze down, saints and sibyls alike seeming to guard the shelves. One feels that silence here is not emptiness but policy, a chosen stillness designed to protect mysteries from being profaned by careless hands. For the Templars, who themselves trafficked in secrecy, such treatment is almost poetic. Their legacy, wrapped in rumour, is kept in a vault where silence is the final word. And yet silence is not absolute. It hints, it gestures, it refuses to close the door entirely. The letter of 1310 survives, however fragmentary. Clement's enigmatic reply remains daring us to interpret. The coded bundles still sit on shelves, unopened but not erased. Silence here does not destroy, it withholds, inviting those who listen carefully to hear what is not spoken. As we leave the Vatican's shadowy corridors, the story does not end, it deepens. The silence becomes a voice, and its echoes lead us north, to stone walls carved with symbols that whisper in their own language. Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland rises with pillars twisted in spirals, with carvings of plants that should not exist in medieval stone, with hollow chambers beneath its floor that have never been opened. If the Vatican preserves silence on parchment, Rosslyn preserves it in stone, and together they continue the melody of absence that hums beneath the legend of Atlantis. North of Edinburgh, where the hills of Midlothian slope gently into valleys threaded with mist, stands Rosslyn Chapel. Its stone walls rise from the earth like a carved reliquary, every inch of its surface adorned with patterns that seem less like ornament than like language. For centuries, Rosslyn has been a place where silence speaks louder than sermons, where shadows gather in carved arches, and where the air itself feels heavy with secrets. If the Vatican preserved mystery in missing pages, Rosslyn does so in stone, each block engraved with symbols that whisper of worlds both near and far. Among the most debated carvings within Rosslyn are those that appear to depict maize and aloe vera, plants native to the Americas, unknown in Europe before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The stalks of maize, etched into the chapel's stonework, stand tall and unmistakable, their kernels arranged in the familiar pattern of corn cobs. Scholars who first noticed them gasped at the implication. If the carving truly represents maize, it would suggest knowledge of the New World decades before Columbus's voyage in 1492. How could such an image have found its way into a Scottish chapel built in the mid-15th century? Some dismiss the resemblance as coincidence. Perhaps the carving was meant to depict stylized wheat or another plant, and modern eyes have imposed meaning upon it. Yet the detail is striking: the shape, the texture, the spacing of kernels. The possibility that masons at Rosslyn had heard tales of distant lands, or even seen samples of foreign plants, cannot be easily dismissed. If knowledge of the Americas circulated secretly through Templar or Allied channels, Rosslyn may have captured it in stone long before it entered official history. Another marvel is the so-called apprentice pillar, a column of stone that twists upward in an elegant spiral, its curves echoing the Fibonacci sequence and the natural growth of plants. According to legend, the master mason had travelled abroad to learn of this design, leaving his apprentice behind. When he returned, he found the young man had carved the pillar to perfection without instruction, guided only by vision. Enraged, the master struck him dead. The pillar thus bears not only mathematical beauty, but the stain of human jealousy, a reminder that knowledge often comes at terrible cost. The spiral itself seems more than decorative. It evokes the same circular motif that threads through Plato's Atlantis, through Salamanca's dotted line, through Avignon's mirrored diagram. A helix of stone rising toward heaven, frozen yet alive, it suggests movement, eternity, and hidden harmony. Some have called it a stone hymn, a geometry that hums if only we could hear it. That sense of frozen music becomes literal in the case of another Rosslyn curiosity, a series of cubes carved with intricate patterns along an arch near the organ loft. For centuries, they were thought to be random decoration. But in recent years, musicians and mathematicians studied the patterns and proposed that they correspond to a form of musical notation. When interpreted, the cubes seem to produce a melody, as though the chapel contained not only carved prayers, but carved song, locked into its very architecture. The idea of frozen music is not merely poetic here. It may be literal, stone capturing vibration, holding it in silence until deciphered. Beneath the chapel lies yet another mystery. Radar surveys have detected voids under the floor, hidden chambers never excavated. Some believe these cavities may contain the treasures of the Templars, hidden away after their suppression. Others suggest they may hold documents, relics, or simply be architectural anomalies. For centuries, excavation has been forbidden, and so the chambers remain sealed, their contents, if any, unknown. In this silence, speculation thrives. Are these vaults the resting place of a forgotten archive, perhaps even the echo of Atlantis encoded in stone and soil? The Freemasons, who later claimed Rosslyn as a site of symbolic importance, have woven their own tales into its walls. Documents from Masonic lodges speak of the chamber where the circle remains unbroken, a phrase many interpret as a reference to these hidden voids. Whether fact or fiction, the words harmonize with the broader pattern we have followed: circles, spirals, rings, silence, and the promise of submerged knowledge. Skeptics, of course, remain firm. They argue that the maze carvings are misidentified, the spiral is a flourish of Gothic design, the musical cubes are wishful thinking by enthusiasts, and the voids beneath the chapel are no different from empty spaces found under many medieval structures. To them, Rosslyn is remarkable but not miraculous. Its mysteries are projections of our own longing to find patterns in stone, just as we find patterns in stars. Yet even if every skeptical point is granted, the fact remains: Rosslyn has become a vessel of imagination. Its symbols draw seekers precisely because they resist explanation. They gather myths into themselves like a sponge soaks up water. Templar legends, Masonic lore, whispers of voyages to America, echoes of Atlantis, all converge here, as though the chapel itself were built not merely as a house of worship, but as a reliquary of possibility. Stand inside Rosslyn in the quiet of evening. Sunlight fades through stained glass, leaving the carvings to glow softly in shadow. The spiral pillar rises like a frozen flame. The maze stalks whisper of distant continents. The stone cubes hum with inaudible song. Beneath your feet, chambers sleep. Above your head, arches curve like ribs of a vast organism. The air is heavy with the sense that silence here is alive, breathing, waiting. If the Vatican holds its secrets in locked bundles, Rosslyn keeps them in plain sight, daring us to interpret. Both are forms of silence, one bureaucratic, the other artistic. And both hint at a knowledge too dangerous or too profound to be spoken outright. Perhaps the builders of Rosslyn believed that stone would outlast parchment, that music carved in cubes would endure longer than ink on fragile vellum. If so, they were right. For centuries later, we still stand beneath its arches, still hearing what is not spoken, still wondering what lies beneath. And so, from the vaults of the Vatican to the carvings of Rosslyn, the path continues. The silence of documents becomes the silence of stone, and together they form a chorus that seems to guide us farther back, farther east, to Egypt. There, in the libraries of Alexandria and the traditions of Coptic monks, tales were preserved of a kingdom drowned, of temples built with geometry, of stars read as warnings. As we leave Rosslyn's spiral pillars behind, the Nile's temples rise ahead, waiting with their own whispers of memory and myth. To the east of the Mediterranean, where desert light turns stone into fire at dawn, and the Nile winds its eternal ribbon through the land, Egypt has always carried the aura of an older memory. For the Templars, whose journeys took them not only across Europe but into the Holy Land and beyond, Egypt was more than a battlefield or a trading partner. It was a repository of ancient wisdom, a place where Greek philosophy had been preserved by Arab scribes, where Christian monks of the Coptic Church kept traditions that reached back into pharaonic times. If there was ever a place to seek whispers of drowned kingdoms, Egypt was the threshold where myth and record entwined. Among the manuscripts associated with this current of knowledge is one particularly enigmatic text, known as Al-Makat al-Makiyah, translated loosely as the Book of the Hidden Kingdom. Its origins are debated. Some claim it was compiled by Arab scholars in Alexandria during the 12th century, drawing upon Greek fragments and older Egyptian lore. Others insist it is a much later invention, a Renaissance fabrication dressed in Arabic script to lend it antiquity. Yet within its pages, preserved in Latin translation in a European collection, are passages that arrest the imagination. The book speaks of a great civilization swallowed by the Western Sea, its temples aligned with stars, its priests skilled in measuring time by the heavens. It tells of a warning delivered to rulers who grew arrogant, that the stars foretold a second catastrophe greater than the first. Some passages are allegorical, filled with imagery of lions, serpents, and floodwaters, but others are precise, describing circular cities, geometrical temples, and rituals that mirror the accounts Plato gave in Critias. The parallels are uncanny. What makes the Almaqiyya especially strange are its references to architecture described as the temple of the angle and the circle. The phrase recurs in several places, sometimes with slight variations. Scholars have puzzled over what it might mean. Was it a metaphor for balance, for the union of heaven, the circle, and earth, the angle? Or was it a literal description of a structure, a place where geometry itself was enshrined? Templar traditions often mingled architecture with symbolism, from their round churches modelled on the Holy Sepulchre to their use of sacred numbers in design. To encounter such language in an Egyptian manuscript feels like finding a cousin to their own symbolic vocabulary. A quirky detail within the text makes the mystery even richer. One passage speaks of the tomb without bones, a chamber raised not to house the dead, but to preserve memory. It describes walls inscribed with patterns of circles and triangles, designed so that water poured along them would flow upward against expectation, as though the Nile itself forgot its course. Some take this as poetic exaggeration, a metaphor for spiritual reversal. Others wonder if it records a kind of mnemonic device, a way of encoding star charts and mathematical principles into architecture. The idea that geometry could act as a map, guiding the initiated toward a hidden truth, resonates deeply with Templar fascination for sacred proportion. Debate over the authenticity of Almaqiyya continues. Some historians argue it is little more than a medieval fantasy, borrowing liberally from Plato and dressing his philosophy in exotic robes. The lack of any Arabic original that can be verified makes its provenance suspicious. Yet defenders note that medieval Alexandria was indeed a crossroads of languages where Greek, Arabic, and Coptic traditions intermingled. It is not impossible that such a compilation could have existed, drawing upon lost texts that never survived elsewhere. Even if embellished, it may preserve genuine fragments of ancient lore. The Templars are believed to have had contact with Coptic clergy in Egypt. Documents attest to exchanges of land, correspondence about pilgrimages, and cooperation in maintaining way stations for travelers. Through these channels, manuscripts could easily have changed hands. Whether the Templars themselves studied the Almaqiyya or whether it filtered later into European libraries, the resonance with their symbolic world is striking. The temple of angles and circles could just as easily describe the spirals of Rosslyn or the circular map of Salamanca as it could an Egyptian shrine. It is as though the same melody plays in different keys across distant lands. Imagine a Templar knight resting in Alexandria, the salt of the sea heavy in the air, the great lighthouse still standing against the horizon. In the shadow of Coptic monasteries, he listens to a monk read from a manuscript in Arabic. He hears of temples swallowed by the sea, of stars measuring catastrophe, of circles and angles that preserve divine proportion. Perhaps he cannot grasp every word, but he feels the rhythm, the weight of ancient memory pressing upon him. He returns to Europe carrying not only relics and letters, but impressions, shapes, phrases, whispers that he passes on to his brothers. In time, those impressions crystallize into carvings, maps, and diagrams that echo the lost text. For the listener drifting with this story, Egypt becomes less a place on the map than a dream of continuity. The Nile flows eternal, but beneath its waters lie stories of floods past, of civilizations erased and remembered only in fragments. The temple of angles and circles may never have existed, or it may stand still, buried beneath sand and time. Its purpose may have been spiritual or practical, or both. But in the context of Templar lore, it serves as another thread binding the legend of Atlantis to traditions far older than Europe itself. Skeptics will say the connections are contrived, that Plato's dialogues were accessible enough in translation, and that no exotic manuscript is required to explain why circles and geometry appear in European thought. They may be right. But the persistence of such motifs across cultures is difficult to ignore. When patterns repeat across continents and centuries, the question arises: are we projecting unity where none exists, or are we glimpsing the faint outlines of a shared memory, fractured but enduring? As the desert wind sighs against the stones of Alexandria, the story carries us onward. The Almakat al-Makiyah leaves us with the image of a drowned kingdom, a temple where geometry itself was sacred, a tomb without bones, and water flowing against its course. Whether allegory or record, it harmonizes with the Templar fascination for hidden wisdom and westward horizons. And so, from the sands of Egypt, the trail turns once more to Europe, to the fortress of Gisors in Normandy, where legends speak of sealed chambers filled with iron chests, codices, and references to Terra Secreta, the hidden land. If Egypt preserved the myth in scrolls and symbols, Gisors preserved it in locked rooms, guarded not by sand but by stone. In the green heart of Normandy stands the fortress of Gisors, its towers rising above the quiet town like weathered sentinels. For centuries, Gisors has been more than stone walls and battlements. It has been a crucible of legend, a place where whispers of hidden chambers and forbidden texts have entwined themselves with history. The Templars once guarded this stronghold, and when their order fell, the site became the focus of speculation. For within its depths, some claimed, lay a secret chamber sealed with iron and silence. Accounts from the 14th century tell of a codex hidden here, a manuscript referred to as the Codex of Gisors. Its pages, according to later rumor, spoke of lands mirrored in water and treasures of memory. Alongside the codex were said to be 30 iron chests stored in a vault beneath the castle, their contents unknown. Some imagined they contained gold, relics, or the missing archives of the Templars. Others insisted that what they held was more intangible, knowledge, maps, and scrolls pointing to lands beyond the horizon. The most evocative phrase connected to Gisors is Terra Secreta, the hidden land. Notes from monastic records of the 14th century use the term in contexts that seem, at first glance, alchemical. Alchemy was rich in metaphors of transformation, and Terra Secreta might have meant nothing more than the elusive substance sought by the philosopher's stone. Yet the wording also carries the literal sense of an undiscovered territory, a continent or island not yet revealed. In this double meaning lies the fuel for centuries of speculation. Was Gisors the guardian of esoteric philosophy, or of geographical memory, perhaps even of Atlantis itself? The story of the sealed chamber gained new life in the 12th century, long before the Templar trials, when King Henry I of England is said to have imprisoned knights at Gisors, burying with them treasures of uncertain nature. Later, when the Templars took possession, the tale deepened. The treasures were theirs, or they added their own to the vault. In the 1960s, local workers digging beneath the castle claimed to have stumbled upon a network of underground passages. Though quickly sealed again by authorities, these tunnels reignited speculation. Some swore they saw doorways barred with iron, leading into chambers untouched for centuries. A quirky detail often cited by enthusiasts is the geometry of the keep itself. The Tower of Gisors is octagonal, a design rare for Norman castles, but resonant with Templar symbolism. The octagon represents transition, the bridge between square, earth, and circle, heaven. To find such a shape here invites the imagination to believe the entire fortress was designed as a symbolic container, an architectural cipher encoding the mysteries it guarded. Whether coincidence or intention, the octagon has become part of the lore, a silent signpost pointing toward hidden meaning. Debate over Gisors has been as fierce as any in Templar lore. Skeptics argue that the supposed codex and chests never existed, that the stories were spun by later generations hungry for romance. They point out that excavations in the 20th century, though restricted, revealed nothing conclusive. To them, Gisors is another case of myth blossoming in the cracks of history. Yet others reply that too much smoke has gathered around this fortress for there to be no fire at all. Reports of sealed chambers, references to terra secreta, the persistence of local legend, taken together, they form a pattern too compelling to dismiss outright. Imagine standing in the courtyard of Gisors at dusk, the stone walls bathed in the fading glow of the sun. Beneath your feet lies the hidden earth, chambers that may or may not contain relics of a vanished order. The grass sways gently, but the silence beneath feels heavy, as though waiting. The word terra secreta hums in the air, suggesting not only hidden land but hidden knowledge, the convergence of geography and philosophy. In this stillness, the fortress becomes more than a ruin. It becomes a threshold. One tradition claims that within the Codex of Gisors were diagrams of lands mirrored. These were said to depict coastlines arranged in symmetrical patterns, as though the cartographer sought to show not the earth as it was, but as it might appear when reflected in water. Some interpret this as allegory, a metaphor for the spiritual world mirrored in the physical. Others whisper that it was a cryptic way of drawing Atlantis itself, a continent remembered in fragments, mirrored in myth, preserved not openly, but in symbolic form. The legend of 30 iron chests deepens the intrigue. Why 30? Some suggest the number echoes Christ's 30 pieces of silver, the price of betrayal, suggesting that the chests contained evidence dangerous to the church. Others argue it reflects the 30 degrees of initiation in later Masonic tradition, a foreshadowing of symbolic hierarchies. Still others insist it is arbitrary, a detail added by storytellers to lend specificity to their tales. Whatever the reason, the number has stuck, and the image of 30 iron chests slumbers in the imagination like a dragon's hoard, sealed away in darkness. A curious note appears in a 15th century chronicle, mentioning that Gisors was a house of silence, a phrase not explained but suggestive. Perhaps it meant the fortress was quiet after its military importance waned. Perhaps it was a metaphor for decline, Or perhaps it hinted, however obliquely, that Gisors was known as a place where silence itself was kept, where secrets were guarded not by words but by walls. The phrase harmonizes with Clement's line, "Let silence do what justice cannot," and with the broader motif that has followed us, silence as the vessel of memory. Skeptics warn us again, silence is fertile ground for projection. Every missing record, every sealed chamber, every vague phrase becomes an invitation to imagine wonders. They remind us that real history often disappoints, that most vaults contain only dust and stones. And yet, in the case of Gisors, imagination is the very thing that keeps the place alive. Its legends have drawn seekers for centuries, binding the fortress into the greater story of the Templars and the dream of Atlantis. As the night deepens over Normandy, Gisors settles into quiet. The octagonal keep casts its shadow on the grass, the town lights flicker below, and the air carries the scent of damp earth. Beneath, perhaps, lie iron chests, perhaps only stone. Above, the stars scatter their light, the same stars once noted in Tomar's records, the same stars that guided ships westward. The fortress does not answer, it keeps its silence. But in that silence, the imagination hears the faint echo of Terra Secreta, the hidden land, waiting. And so the path bends once more. From Gisors, with its sealed chambers and whispered codex, the story draws toward conclusion. The clues have mounted: the vanished fleet, the coded letter, the maps, the diagrams, the carvings, the manuscripts, the fortress. Whether Atlantis was real or not, a pattern has emerged, a rhythm of silence and symbol. In the next step, this rhythm gathers into a reflection, a summation. The sense of Atlantis not as land discovered, but as shadow remembered, an echo pulsing through time. As the trail lengthens behind us, La Rochelle's vanished fleet, the letter to Clement, the Salamanca chart, the mirrored manuscript of Avignon, the strange stars of Tomar, the carvings at Rosslyn, the Egyptian codex, the sealed fortress of Gisors, one truth begins to emerge with quiet insistence. No single clue on its own demands belief in a sunken kingdom across the Atlantic. Each is fragile, ambiguous, subject to skepticism, and yet together they form a pattern that feels less like coincidence and more like echo. Not Atlantis itself, but its shadow, dark, persistent, impossible to ignore. The strength of a shadow is that it needs no substance of its own. It is cast by something unseen, proof not of presence but of outline. And so it is with Atlantis in the Templar story. We cannot prove that knights sailed west, nor that they reached shores before Columbus, nor that they preserved maps of lost lands. But the shape of their silence, the rhythm of their symbols, the persistence of motifs in stone and ink, all these suggest that Atlantis mattered to them, if only as myth, if only as allegory, if only as a dream too dangerous to speak aloud. Consider the role of myth in history. Rome traced its origin to a wolf that nursed abandoned twins. Britain claimed descent from Brutus of Troy. Nations have always sought legitimacy in legends, shaping identity around stories that blur the line between memory and imagination. For the Templars, warriors, mystics, builders, bankers, the legend of Atlantis may have served as more than entertainment. It may have been a mirror of their own fate, a powerful order brought low by pride, swallowed by the tides of politics, remembered only in fragments. To imagine Atlantis was, in a sense, to imagine themselves. A quirky observation strengthens this comparison. Plato described Atlantis as a circle, land, water, rings of order around a sacred center. The Templars, in their architecture, often favored the circle too, round churches modeled on the Holy Sepulchre, circular seals, circular symbolism in manuscripts. It is as if the geometry of Atlantis seeped into their identity, or perhaps their identity predisposed them to recognize themselves in Plato's island. In either case, the circle binds them, echoing through time as the motif of their shadowed kingdom. Skeptics remain insistent. All this is projection, pattern-seeking by restless minds. Rosslyn's carvings are wheat, not maize. Tomar's stars are borrowed, not observed. Avignon's diagram is altar, not Atlantis. Gisors' vaults hold nothing more than soil and stones. Perhaps they are right. Perhaps every clue collapses under scrutiny, leaving nothing but dust. And yet the story endures, told and retold, whispered in monasteries, debated in universities, dramatized in novels, even now carried into the quiet of night. If it were only dust, why would it persist with such vitality? Shadows, after all, lengthen only when the sun continues to shine. There is also the curious resilience of the Atlantis legend itself. It has never quite belonged to any one culture. Born in Athens, preserved by Arab scholars, reawakened in Renaissance Europe, echoed in Freemasonry, revived in the modern imagination, it shifts shape to fit the dream of each age. For explorers, it was a geographical hope. For mystics, a spiritual allegory. For scientists, a hypothesis to test. For the Templars, it may have been all these at once, a myth to carry, a code to study, a dream to guide them west. Imagine then a knight standing on the deck of a ship at La Rochelle in 1307, the night before the arrests. He looks westward, where the sun has fallen, and thinks of Plato's rings, of drowned kings, of temples beneath the sea. He knows the order's time is ending, that persecution waits at dawn, and so he places his hope not in land he can touch, but in a land remembered only in whispers. Perhaps he sails, perhaps he hides, perhaps he vanishes into history. What remains is not his journey, but his dream, the shadow of Atlantis, cast long over the centuries. A peculiar detail lingers in this shadow, the repetition of silence as a form of presence. In the Vatican's missing pages, in the sealed vault of Gisors, in the forbidden chambers beneath Rosslyn, in the cryptic phrasing of Al-Makat al-Makia, silence is never emptiness, it is structure, deliberate, shaped. It functions like negative space in art. What is absent forms the outline of what might be there. Atlantis, in this sense, may never have been a land at all. It may be the name we give to silence when silence takes form. This perspective shifts the question. Rather than asking, did the Templars find Atlantis, we might ask, why did they guard the silence of Atlantis if they never reached it? Why did they allow the idea to haunt their symbols and structures? Why did they let its geometry and its myth seep into their legacy? Perhaps they understood something we forget, that myths need not be true to shape destiny. By carrying the shadow of Atlantis, they carried a compass, not of geography, but of imagination. And in that compass lies their enduring power. The Templars vanish, yet the imagination refuses to release them. The fleet sails into mist, and still we hear the tolling of bells. Rosslyn remains unexcavated, and still we envision treasures beneath. Gisors remain sealed, and still we picture iron chests waiting. The shadow of Atlantis lingers not because of evidence, but because of the silence that enfolds it. And silence, like the ocean, is vast enough to hold anything. As the night deepens, the shadow stretches longer, reaching not only into the past, but into our own dreams. We too become part of the chain, listeners who allow the story to breathe again. who carry its rhythm a little farther. If you have followed this far, if the bells of La Rochelle and the spirals of Rosslyn and the whispers of Alexandria have stirred something within you, then you are already walking within the shadow of Atlantis. But the journey does not end in shadow. There remains one final step, to let the story slow, to let the rhythm soften, to allow the shadow itself to dissolve into night. In the final chapter, The Wind Down, we will follow the Templars not into discovery, but into dream, where steel grows quiet, where bells toll faintly through mist, where the deep forest of sleep welcomes us home. Night drapes its cloak across the story. The voices of parchment and stone, of pillars and maps, of vanished fleets and sealed vaults, have all spoken in turn. And yet, what they have left us is not certainty, but something softer, something more fragile, a hush that stretches across centuries. The tale of the Templars and Atlantis does not end with revelation. It ends with silence, as if the very ocean insisted on keeping its secrets hidden beneath waves. Still the fragments linger like embers glowing faintly in the dark. La Rochelle, where bells once tolled as ships slipped into mist. Salamanca, where ink etched a haunting question. Where is the way to the sunken kingdom? Rosslyn, where stone spiraled into music no ear could hear. Egypt, where scribes spoke of temples of angles and circles. Gisors, where iron chests may still sleep beneath the earth. Each piece is incomplete, yet together they weave a rhythm that hums just beyond the edge of certainty, like a song half remembered in dreams. The shadow of Atlantis persists, not because we have proof, but because the absence itself calls to us. It is a reminder that history is never whole, that silence can be more eloquent than speech. The Templars may have vanished into politics and persecution, but their aura lingers because of what they did not say, because of the gaps they left unfilled. In those gaps we imagine fleets sailing into the Atlantic, stars unfamiliar to northern skies, kingdoms drowned yet remembered. The motif returns, gentle now like a lullaby. Steel once rang upon stone, the armor of knights glinting in torchlight as they rode out of their fortresses. But here, in the wind down, steel no longer clashes. It rests quietly, dulled by centuries, its sheen softened like moonlight on water. The bells that tolled across harbours and cloisters no longer summon warriors or warn of arrests. They toll faintly, like echoes across fog, like distant chimes from towers long crumbled. Mist rises again, veiling coasts and fortresses, softening edges until land and sea blur. And beyond the mist, the deep forest waits, silent, timeless, sheltering, where stories fold into shadows and dreams take root beneath the canopy. A quirky detail surfaces one last time, as if to smile in the twilight. In Breton folklore, sailors said that when they drifted too far west, they could sometimes hear bells tolling beneath the sea. Not the bells of storms or ships, but church bells, ringing from chapels swallowed by water. The sound was said to draw men home, guiding them back to shore. Perhaps this was only the groan of waves against cliffs, or the cry of whales beneath the surface. But perhaps, too, it was memory itself, Atlantis, ringing softly, reminding us that stories never drown completely. Skeptics still shake their heads. They remind us that maize is wheat, that stars are scribal errors, that maps are allegories. They remind us that silence is not proof, that imagination is not evidence. And they are right. But they cannot erase the hush that gathers when we contemplate the pattern. They cannot silence the bells we hear in dreams. The story's power lies not in convincing us that Atlantis was found, but in reminding us how much of history will always remain a mystery. As the rhythm slows, imagine yourself on the deck of a Templar ship, sailing westward in silence. The sea is calm, mist curling around the hull. The stars above shimmer faintly, some familiar, some strange. The knights around you are quiet, their mantles white against the night, their steel no longer weapons but ornaments of memory. A bell tolls once, low and resonant, then fades into the fog. You stand at the threshold of the unknown, the Pillars of Hercules far behind, the ocean stretching endlessly ahead. And in that hush, you feel it, the presence of a kingdom not seen but sensed, a memory cast like a shadow across the water. The forest of sleep rises within you, trees close overhead, their branches weaving like cathedral arches. The air is cool, the ground soft with moss. In this forest, the story settles. The Templars vanish into the undergrowth, their banners dissolving into mist. The bells toll one last time, distant and tender. The steel rests quietly against roots and stones. You walk deeper, slower, until the forest embraces you fully, and the story itself becomes a dream. This is the gift of the wind down, not answers, but rest. The shadow of Atlantis is not meant to be solved tonight. It is meant to linger, to drift with you into sleep, to remind you that history and imagination are woven from the same thread. What matters is not whether the Templars found the lost kingdom, but that we still hear their silence, still feel their echo, still dream their dream. And so we close. The bells have rung, the steel has softened, the mist has risen, the deep forest has welcomed us home. Let the story fade now into the quiet of night. Let the ocean keep its secrets. Let the shadow of Atlantis stretch into your dreams. Good night.